Okie dokie, everybody. So here we go. We are officially live, starting a little bit later than normal this morning because Zoom is apparently having some issues. But we are going live now officially on Facebook and Instagram. So glad to be here on this lovely Monday morning. I'm having a great morning other than the tech issues. I'm telling you, it's pumpkin spice everything at my house because fall is here and I don't care what y'all say. But we are here for the Astro-Babble. We are going to be taking 5 specific charts that have been donated by you, my lovely followers, and we will be analyzing those 5 charts visually. For those of you who are tuning in on Instagram, you can always check out the visual charts that I'm going to be pulling up on the recording, which I'll throw up on the YouTube channel. However, if you are, oh goodness, and a software update just decides to pop up on my computer. That's always like super fun. Yeah, so if you are watching on Instagram, you're going to need to check out the visual charts on the YouTube recording. However, for those of you tuning in on Facebook, you will be able to see the charts. And just as a reminder, if you would like to book a consult, try some online classes with me, you can always go to scorpiorisingastrology.com. And if you would like to be on the live streams, you can always private message me your birth date, place, and exact birth time, and I'll add you to the list. Okay? So let's go ahead and we'll pull up our very first chart. So we have Lunation A from Instagram, who's going to be our first chart of the morning. Let's take a peek-see and look at what's happening from that perspective. So we can see already software. So we have a Sagittarius ascendant. Sagittarius ascendant is going to bring some nice mutable fire energy to the chart, but because Sagittarius is on the ascendant, that makes Jupiter the ruler of the chart. So Jupiter's position in the chart represents the native in this case, and it tells us a lot about the fundamental nature of the person and also where their core personality traits kind of develop. Sagittarius as a sign really gives us this idea of somebody being spunky, a little bit fiery, a little bit more energetic, a little bit more free-spirited. Yeah, but then we have the Jupiter in Libra in this chart in the 11th house, which really just makes them a socialite. And I really enjoy Jupiter being in the 11th because it is somebody who can just kind of Pied Piper a crowd, especially with Jupiter being in Libra. Not necessarily a sign that Jupiter is strong in, but Jupiter is a very social planet. It is the gas giant. And so when we look at Jupiter in the 11th in this chart as the chart ruler, we find that there's a really nice synergy in the chart with just being super social, very much about 11th house topics like philanthropic efforts, working with nonprofit organizations, tribes, communities, groups, friends. Yeah. So that's a big part of the life that we can look into already. We also have Uranus in Libra here, so it's about controlling the uncontrollable as well. It wouldn't surprise me if this person in particular starts to bring forward a lot of those Uranus in Libra and Jupiter in Libra themes into the 11th, where she's taking these very massive energies in the chart and trying to bring them into balance through kind of a nice way of her 11th house of friendships and her Sagittarius ascendant. But those are some pretty heavy hitting planets that are going to need to find a less unpredictable nature with Uranus and a less kind of grandiose nature with Jupiter. Otherwise, we're going to fall into some pretty interesting patterns with that if those planets don't get their voice in the chart. Let's take a peek. We also have Cancer that's very active in the chart in the 8th house. So we have the Sun in Cancer in this chart, as well as Mars in Cancer in this chart, both in the 8th house of death, taxes, estates, business. And so when we look at the 8th house as the Sun's placement, we're going to find a natural entrepreneurship quality in this person, which kind of goes along with the chart. We have Sagittarius on the ascendant, we have Jupiter in Libra in the 11th, which brings this really nice kind of personable, kind of mayoral energy would be a good way to say it, into the chart. And to have the Sun in Cancer in the 8th, it really just kind of confirms the idea of that nurturing side of Cancer being about business and productivity. However, when we look at yeah, perfect. That's absolutely fabulous. Getting some comments on Instagram right now. Pluto Rising, I'm a fan of the name. Yeah, definitely. When we look at the 8th house associations, when primary planets are placed here, it really does bring forward that really heavy 8th house topic. of death, taxes, estates, and I find also a lot of lawyers in this house. Not just estate lawyers, but lawyers in general, because lawyers tend to be brought in when taxes, estates, and death are very, very prominent in the chart. So when we find, especially if there are 6 house themes coming into the equation as well, it's kind of almost guaranteed that I've seen. And a lot of people will associate the 9th house with law, and I disagree with that. That's more of a 12-letter alphabet thing. So we try to avoid that. But anyway, let's talk about this Mars, though. So this Mars is in the sign of his fall in Cancer, so does not like to be in Cancer. If we think of Mars as that fiery planet of action, of drive, of trying to move forward, take no prisoners, and conquer, that very aggressive energy, it doesn't do well when trying to be expressed through that maternal, that loving, that compassionate energy of Cancer. Cancer kind of smothers Mars in that way. It's kind of like a wet blanket over the Mars. So I think in this chart, it definitely works within a good context of favor, because we don't want Mars driving into the 8th house of business and triggering the harsher aspects of that Jupiter-Uranus. We don't want this person to be that sales representative who's just going to make the kill. We don't want them to step forward and start to activate the hotter, more unpredictable, more fierce aspects of that Mars. And so I think Mars in Cancer is actually really appropriate for this chart, because it still expresses Mars's ability to get the job done. But how Mars goes about that from a Cancerian perspective in the 8th is almost more of a servant type energy, which I really, really appreciate in this chart as we continue to look at the themes. It's beautiful how this chart just continues to ping through the houses and really show, like, it's these planets that have the potential to be very grandiose are tempered, and they really are allowing a lot of their more generous aspects to come forward, and I enjoy that personally. So let's move into the 6th house of work, health, pets. When we look at a moon in Taurus, exalted moon, absolutely fabulous, love it. But then we also have Saturn in Taurus. So when we look at Saturn as a planet, especially being in the fixed Earth sign of Taurus, this is one of the heaviest placements that we could potentially see in a chart. The only way that we could make that placement heavier is if we put Saturn retrograde, and then it would truly be the densest planet and the densest sign going backwards. But having Saturn here in the 6th house really does bring this kind of slow and steady wins the race approach to the work dynamic. And for some reason, the more I look at that Saturn in Taurus, the more I'm thinking of this turtle archetype really, really coming forward in the 6th house. Just absolutely great analogy is just that kind of turtle tortoise energy with the moon in Taurus, just very steadfast, very grounded, kind of all feet on the ground at once, just really kind of making sure that everything is in its proper place, that resources are used effectively. This is also a great quality in the workplace for managers, especially managers who work in editing. I've seen this a lot in like newspaper editors, blogger editors, content editors, as well as like fashion designers. These are the people that in the workplace, people bring their ideas to intentionally get shot down. And I love the moon in Taurus is here too, because it does bring that softness. It does bring that curved edge to the no. But Saturn in Taurus is all about no. It's about saying there's a more efficient way to do this. There's a better way to do this. You're not seeing the straightest path. And so I'm going to tell you no, and I'm going to explain to you why. Yeah. So very interesting dynamics when we look at just all of this desire to help, and how this desire to help is kind of brought forward in the chart is through that 6th house of daily tasks when it comes to editing, chopping, cutting, and really making sure that there's an efficiency that comes forward, but that efficiency is paired with a sense of slowness. Yeah. Interesting choice Interesting choice with a Mercury in Gemini at 29 degrees in the 7th house of relationships. That's pretty fun. Very spunky partner you're looking for. Very dynamic, very charismatic, very mentally stimulating. I think that when we look at Gemini on the cusp of the 7th, and when we look at Mercury and Gemini being here too, the first thing that you're going to be attracted to in a partner is the mind and is the mental faculties, because Mercury is that planet that rules the mind, and he is in his home sign of Gemini. And I think that that's a beautiful place for Mercury to be in. But that Mercury and Gemini archetype is very much what you're looking for in a spouse. So if somebody is a little bit too predictable, if somebody's a little bit too heavy or practical, if somebody's a little bit too controlling as well, those are going to be turnoffs for you right away. But then also, if somebody comes to the table and they're spontaneous and they're dynamic and they're interested and interesting and they're constantly flitting around from one idea to the next and they're very inspiring to you as a person, that's going to be like really, really good relationship material from that perspective. So let's see, what else do we want to talk about in this chart? No, chart's gone cold. I think that's pretty much it for this chart. So Lunation A on Instagram, thank you so much for turning in your chart to me for science, and we will continue to move on. Good morning, Gina. Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, everybody on Instagram and Facebook who's tuning in. Let's go ahead and pull up chart number 2. The midheaven was in Virgo. Yes. Okay. So we're going to talk about Gina next, actually. So Gina, thank you for tuning in on Facebook. I appreciate you. Let's take a peek at Gina's chart. So we've got Capricorn on the ascendant, making this a Saturn-ruled chart. Saturn is also in his detriment in Aries in the 4th. That's a pretty rough placement, but the North Node is here, so we have some pretty serious lessons coming forward in the chart just right off the bat. So we need to understand a couple things about your chart, Gina, just as an FYI. So having a Capricorn ruled chart is a very interesting dynamic that I found with my clients, with my students, anybody who has Capricorn chart. It's a slow to grow chart, but it's definitely one of those charts that matures like a fine wine. Because your chart is associated with Saturn, your Saturn return, both around 30 and around 60, are going to be major pivot points in your life. But because the ripening of your chart is tied with those Saturn maturation placements, it's going to be, especially for the first 30 years of life, really, really kind of hard, difficult, and the rougher parts of Saturn coming forward in your chart. Especially when it comes to the 4th house themes of family and home, which are naturally a struggle for you because we have the planet that rules your chart in its least favorite sign in your 4th house of home and family. But we also have the North Node here in Aries. And I think that that's something to understand as well, is although the lessons are going to be harder than most, there's also this idea that you're here to learn about what it means to have your own space, what it means to cultivate a family of your own, what it means to break through a lot of the karma and the patterns that seem to be stamped on your chart. So that's just something to kind of be aware of, is especially when Saturn is afflicted and it's ruling the ascendant, a lot of physical body issues can be present because the ruling planet of the ascendant in the 1st house of the body is compromised. Specifically, we would look at joint issues, teeth issues, as well as any kind of bone issues, especially if those areas then create a secondary effect in the blood, the head, as well as the muscles of the body. So those two body systems, Aries and Capricorn, being very, very important for you to kind of take care of throughout the life, but might have been extremely problematic for the first 16 years or so, halfway through that Saturn return. We do have a pileup in this chart. We have I tell you guys that themes happen, right? I tell you that themes happen in these chart readings, and I don't predict. I don't like I just I put you on the list. Like, you send me your stuff and I put you on the list in the order that I get your messages. And it just so happens that I started a new format where I'm seeing 5 people instead of 8. And still, our first chart had the sun in Cancer and Mars in Cancer, and our second chart also has the sun in Cancer and the Mars in Cancer. Very, very funny. Thanks, universe. I appreciate you. But what's very, very different about this formation is we have not just the sun in Cancer, we have Mars in Cancer in cazimi with, at a 0-degree conjunction with the sun in Cancer, and Venus in that same cazimi in Cancer within 1 degree of the sun. So massive influence of both Venus and Mars coming forward in the sun, the planet that represents our ego and our sense of identity. And all of this is happening within the 7th house of relationships. So lots to unpack here, Gina. Lots to unpack. First and foremost, whenever we see Venus and Mars co-present within the same house, I always kind of turn towards the idea of masculine and feminine principles needing to be a theme throughout the life, and balancing those two energies, because they're not just in the same house, they're also conjoining the sun, which backlights their presence and their relevance in your chart. Because Mars is afflicted, we might have some masculinity issues in the chart, and that doesn't necessarily conform to normal gender roles, but it's the idea that your young principle is a little bit out of balance. Your ability to move forward, your ability to act, your ability to make a decision for yourself and not rely on the thoughts and feelings of others is a little bit compromised. Now, you do have Venus in Cancer, I really enjoy Venus in Cancer, because it does bring this kind of octomom energy into the equation, and really does bring forward a lot of caring and a lot of empathy. However, because Mars is stifled and Venus is kind of, in a certain way, thriving through a water sign, I think that there's a power play that needs to be understood, is especially because all of this is happening within the 7th house of relationships. You have a tendency to partner with people who might try to control you through their own conditional love. Yeah. Let me say that in a different way. So the idea of your Mars being compromised, yeah, but the idea that both your Venus and Mars conjoining the sun in your 7th house being a very prominent placement, we need to understand that the love that your partner might give to you, especially earlier in life with your early relationships, and already with your home family dynamic kind of askew, a lot of those principles might come with strings attached, and you might find that the people in your life that you trust intimately start to take advantage of you, because although they might care for you deeply, and although they might be willing to support you and able to bring forward a lot of emotional vitality back into your life, and in some ways a feeling of safety, yeah, we have to respect that your boundaries from a family and relationship perspective are not necessarily great. And we have to understand that the medicine here is going to be standing your own ground, is going to be leaning into your own power. And although it is very tempting to absorb yourself into another person relationship-wise, there's a need for you to stand on your own 2 feet. There's a need for you to be a little bit more independent, and to kind of go back to that North Node in Aries, to have a family that is yours, not just that you are a part of, not just kind of being tucked underneath somebody else's wing and saying, okay, this is, I'm just the spouse, right? So that's kind of something to unpack gracefully and gradually over time, not something to rush at all. And interestingly enough, again, we have the same moon placement. We have the moon in Taurus in the 5th. Great, absolutely flawless formation for children. not just because the moon being in the fifth house is great, not just because an earth sign on the fifth house is great, but the moon is also in mutual reception with Venus, goddess of love and abundance. So when we look at this formation, there's a really strong indicator for children in the chart, a really strong indicator for fertility in the chart, and the idea that children might also unlock a part of the heart that is a lot more unconditional, as opposed to the conditional love that we're seeing developing in the seventh house of relationships. Bringing children into the equation for you, even if they're not your biological children, even if you foster, or even if you adopt, or even if you volunteer, with children. The idea of the fifth house of children being one of your exalted placements, that would be an easy area for you to lean into to really make sure that you feel a sense of emotional fulfillment and gratification, where the relationship and the family dynamic that you're trying to form in the seventh and fourth houses might be a little bit stickier if you try to go to the hardware store for milk, right? In those house placements. Let's see what else. Nope. I think that's pretty much about it, honey. I think if you kind of watch that section again, like replay what I'm telling you again, and really just soak it in. I think that's the fundamental lesson, is we have to understand the afflicted Saturn, we have to understand the pile up in the seventh house, and we have to understand the fifth house as a contrast towards where difficulty is in your chart and where ease is located in the chart. And understanding those two polarities is kind of the key to unlocking where a majority of the issues are and a majority of where the strengths are too. Lovely. Thank you, Gina. I'm so glad that you found that helpful. Cool. Okay, so we are 2 charts in. Let's go to our third chart of the morning, who is Hannah. Hannah, my darling. My darling Hannah. Let's take a peek at your chart, shall we? And she's just breaking all the molds. So she's thrown out the themes that we've had so far. Hannah's the renegade this morning. So she's got this Gemini ascendant. She's got this Gemini ascendant, which puts some nice air into the chart, which makes Mercury the ruler of her chart. Mercury is in Scorpio in the 6th, co-present with Sun in Scorpio and Pluto in Scorpio in the 6th. Oh, Hannah. Oh, Hannah, the things that we can talk about in your chart. I'm absolutely in love with it, darling. So let's talk about a couple things. First and foremost, we need to understand from a medical astrology standpoint why this pile up in the 6th house is important. Okay? Having the Lord of your chart in the 6th house of health naturally means that a health theme is going to be a big part of not just who you are physically, but also what you're going to be doing work-wise. Yeah, so you will not be able to escape medicine. Yeah, it's just kind of part of where you've decided to be. You've put the sun, your center of ego, and the ruler of your chart in the 6th house of health, pets, and work. So there's a workaholic tendency, there's a health tendency, there's an affinity for animals. There's a lot of really interesting kind of pile-ups in the 6th house from that perspective. But having Mercury in Scorpio and having the sun in Scorpio and the secondary ruler of Scorpio, Pluto, all in the 6th house does bring forward some interesting themes for me. I see, because Mercury is the planet of the mind, it rules your chart and is in Scorpio in a health house. You would be an excellent psychotherapist. You would be an excellent counselor. You would be an excellent person to delve into the darker, more seedy, more underworld aspects of the mind and the subconscious. Yeah, because those are the worlds in which Scorpio thrives. Yeah, Scorpio is a sign that really takes the most sensitive, the most vulnerable aspects of a person and really is able to guard those. But with Mercury, in an archetype who is known as the psychopomp, ruling your chart in the 6th house of health, like you have a natural ability to pick people's locks and to mentally kind of delve into those areas that they would be hiding from other people and not necessarily expose them, although you do have the sun in Scorpio, which brings a nice kind of radiance and light to the 6th, which I enjoy. But I think for you, it's about understanding that when you walk into a room and you can almost hear what other people are thinking, and you can profile them really easily, those are talents that should not go to waste, my darling. So whatever you do, I don't care if you're a grocery store clerk. I don't care if you're a dog sitter. I don't care. Whatever you do, the idea of this intense psychological aspect in your chart, I think, needs to be respected, especially because Pluto in Scorpio is here halfway through your life around 50. There's going to be a sense of power that gets unlocked here that you will, frankly, not see coming. It's a beautiful fruition that will continue to be a theme in your chart from this perspective. So that's just kind of some additional stuff for you. Let's see, we've got the moon in Aries in the 11th, but she's in the sign of her fall. She doesn't really like to be in Aries. South Node is also in Aries, so it's not really like an important place. Yeah, the one thing that I would say about this moon is that it's very easy for you to get very competitive very quickly. Yeah, especially with friends and in social situations. It's very easy for you to step up to the plate and try to prove yourself, especially to gain the affection of others, especially to gain the affection of a spouse. Yeah. And there is a certain value to that, and there is a certain dynamic of that, like you strutting your stuff and showing off your talents, like that's all well and good, but you're not here to master that lesson, darling. You have the South Node in Aries. You don't need to prove yourself this time around. It's not about how good you are. Yeah, we know how good you are. And frankly, you're supposed to be a little bit more in the shadows this go around, working with Scorpio, not necessarily out and about, taking charge of the world with Aries. Let's see. So we do have a really interesting combination of planets. We have Venus and Mars in the 7th house as well. Sagittarius is that ruler, and then Jupiter in Sagittarius, the most prosperous planet of the chart, in his home sign in the 7th house of relationships. That's a pretty sweet deal, Hannah. That's a pretty sweet deal. The partner that you will naturally be attracted to will be very much the archetype of Jupiter, somebody who is prosperous, somebody who is abundant, somebody who is larger than life, somebody who is constantly seeking, somebody who is constantly pursuing the truth of the matter, somebody who's always embodying the fool archetype, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, not knowing where they're going, but just kind of going wherever the wind takes them. It's a beautiful, beautiful energy to have in the 7th house of relationships. But just like the last chart, whenever I see Mars and Venus co-present within the same house, we also have gender identity that needs to be worked on. We have this idea of potential bisexuality. We have the idea of the masculine, feminine, the yin, the yang principles co-present within the same place in the 7th house of relationships. So understanding that dynamic and unpacking those energies a little bit more clearly is going to be part of the struggle of relationships in terms of how that Mars gets expressed and how that Venus gets expressed through both yourself, your partner, and your interactions together. And in fact, when we talk about partnerships, you have this North Node in Libra in the 5th ruled by that Venus in Sagittarius. So when we unpack this chart more deeply, I think the north of your compass, the purpose of your chart, is really to understand what this idea of parenting is for you, what this idea is of a partnership that is both fulfilling but also prosperous in many different ways. The North Node in the 5th house asks you to explore the ideas of sexuality, of parenting, of children, of what it means to create and be creative, both on, a physical level in terms of childbirth, but also on an artistic level in terms of what can you possibly bring into the world that means more than just what you do day to day, right? It's a little bit more of a question of legacy than it is about anything else. So that's interesting dynamics there. Okay, cool. Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate you lending your charts to the live stream. We are just a little bit more than halfway through. We have two more charts. And before we get into these last two charts, just as a reminder, if you would like to be a part of the live stream, feel free to private message me your birth date, place, and exact birth time. We'll add you to the list. If you would like to learn astrology or set up a private consult, you can always go to scorpiorisingastrology.com, my website, and schedule or buy classes through there directly, and support my work. But anyway, let's go on to our last two charts. So we have Stuti, my dear, my darling. I'm such a fan of your chart for many, many different reasons. And let's talk about the main reason. You have Scorpio rising. Yes, I love it. But you have a very particular brand of Scorpio rising that's a little bit fiercer, a little bit darker, a little bit more intense, and much more intimidating than most Scorpio risings. Not only do you have Scorpio rising, but you have the ruler of your chart here. You have Mars in Scorpio present. You also have Saturn in Scorpio present, who is also retrograde, and Pluto in Scorpio present, who is also retrograde as well. So that's three very important planets in your first house of self, in your first house of the body as well. That really makes for an interesting but slightly toxic combination. So let's kind of unpack this gradually. Having a Scorpio ascendant and kind of compounded by all of the other planets here, we need to understand that there are 4 body systems that you need to pay attention to. The first is going to be the colon, the second is going to be reproductive, the third is going to be bladder, the fourth is going to be sinus. Yeah, those 4 body systems are going to be your barometers for health. So if those 4 body systems are not working properly, you are out of balance. And those will be kind of the whistleblower body systems to tell you whether or not you're in alignment, both physically and spiritually. Those are going to be where your tension collects, first and foremost. And also potential issues here. Just from an astrological perspective, we have to recognize that we have both malefic planets in the first house of the body. So health is going to be a very important thing for you to focus on throughout the life, especially when it comes to basic needs, yeah? Like eating food with a lot of fiber. Vegetarianism would be very, very important for you specifically. Because of that rich fiber content, vegetable and plant-based food profile. When we look at reproductive issues, we need to be very, very aware that the body is hypersensitive reproductive-wise, and that Saturn as the restrictive force and Mars as the potential kind of injuring and bleeding force, that cycles of menstruation need to be paid attention to very, very closely, because that's just a big part of what your chart is saying right off the bat. Energetically, there's a lot of really deep, dark, very spiritual, very hypersensitive, very probing, very detective-oriented energy that's in this first house. This is where you get all of your psychic talents. This is where you get all of your dream potential. This is where you get all of your intuition. But this comes at a cost. Yeah. Because you have both malefics here in your first house of self, the first impression that you make with people is often going to be extremely intimidating. Extremely intimidating. Even if you don't mean it to be. Yeah. You walk into a room and people back away because they think you're out for blood. Yeah. And what they don't understand is your perceptive skills are so high that you are able to expose their truth in under 30 seconds flat, right? Which makes them feel very vulnerable, which is why they back away. It doesn't mean that you're dangerous. It means that you're perceptive. Yeah. It's very different. You know, if we had Aries on the first house cusp and Aries on the ascendant, it would be a very different energy. Very different energy. That would be a head-on, straightforward, I'm going to kill you, aggressive type Aries forward energy of that expression of Mars. But here, you know, Scorpio likes to play in the shadows. And that being such a big part of your personal identity, we need to not just respect that and honor that, but also understand how people are going to perceive that. And because Scorpio is one of those signs that a lot of people misunderstand, because it prefers to be misunderstood, right? Walls don't just keep people out, they also keep you in, right? It's not always healthy to be misunderstood. Yeah, it is a defense mechanism. It does allow you to skate by unnoticed, but when you want to be noticed, it's hard to turn those things off. Yeah. So a lot of researching Scorpio is going to be very, very important. Even though your sun sign is Aries, there's so much happening from a Scorpio perspective. I would consider you more of a Scorpio than Aries. Yeah. But the ruler of your chart, Mars, is ruling your sun in Aries, which is an exalted planet and absolutely gorgeous. In the 6th house of work, co-present with Mercury, who's out of combustion in the sign of Aries as well in the 6th house, who's also making a lovely trine to the MC in Leo in the 10th, ruled by the sun. Fabulous work placements, my dear. Absolutely fabulous work placements. Work is so easy. It comes so easy to you. Gosh darn it. I can't even imagine. Just so much synastry, so much ease, so much effortlessness for you to walk into a situation and take control of it is absolutely child's play. Damn. Seriously, you got it going on. I'm so impressed with these placements. You even have an exalted Venus and Pisces in the 5th house of children. So much good stuff. So much good stuff, darling. So if you're able to master that 1st house of the body and of the self, I mean, there's a lot of ease that you can lean into from a career and a success perspective, for sure. I just really enjoy that. The issues here, though, are going to be, especially right now, because you have this placement corresponding to a lot of transits that are happening. You have Jupiter and Capricorn in the 3rd. So Jupiter is the most prosperous planet in the chart, but in your chart, Jupiter is in his least favorite position. And Jupiter being in his least favorite position diminishes a lot of his power. And because he is also ruling your 2nd house of finance, the idea that no matter how hard you work, no matter how high you climb, there's always going to be this questioning of wealth. There's always going to be this monetary weak spot would be a good way to say it, not just from a physical money perspective, but also from a self-valuing perspective. There's a lot to unpack here, for sure. Jupiter being in Capricorn right now is also really difficult because we have Saturn, we have Pluto, we have Jupiter, all retrograde in Capricorn in your 3rd house of writing, teaching, communication. So there's a lot of very hard lessons that are coming down your pipeline right now. Much, much harder than I think you realize. Like your chart is so much about finding the advantage and leveraging that advantage and leaning into your power, which you have a lot of in your chart. But I think if there was something that I could, if there was a piece of wisdom that I could give to you, yeah, it's recognizing right now that the deck is stacked against you in many, many different ways. Yeah. So don't be so hard on yourself, because when the most prosperous planet in your chart is naturally not in his favorite place, and everything in the skies right now are beating down on that same placement, kind of like beating a dead horse, like there's so much hurt that you're trying to just gloss over, because if you acknowledge it, then you're going to collapse under the weight of it. And I understand that. I understand that you need to move forward, and I understand that it's important that you not look at it straight in the face. But I also very much encourage you to take a breath, take a seat, be patient, and don't necessarily beat yourself up so hard, because the odds are actually not in your favor right now. And that's okay. That's okay. Right? Especially from a financial perspective. We need to be saving right now. We need to be hoarding resources right now and not necessarily making very big financial leaps. Okay, so that's the end of that chart. So thank you, Stuti, for donating your chart. I very, very much appreciate it. For personal questions like that, honey, we would need to go one-on-one. This is just a very brief overview of the chart. This isn't supposed to be that specific or that in depth, because I need to look at transits for that. I need to look at many other factors than just the natal chart to answer those kinds of questions. Okay. So let's talk about Sarvagya. So let's take a peek at this chart. Another Saturn-ruled chart. This time Saturn is in Scorpio up in the 10th, co-present with the MC in the North Node. That's fascinating. Ruled by a Mars in Libra in the 9th, though. So when we look at the chart ruler as being Saturn in the 10th, there's often an idea of fame being very, very much a factor in this person's life. But because Saturn is in Scorpio, a sign that is naturally going to be very hidden, it's going to be famous for things that are outside of the mainstream and not necessarily as part of that kind of social spotlight. Whereas if we saw like the 10th house being ruled by Leo and Saturn being in Leo, like that would be a very, very different situation. But because Saturn in Scorpio is present, the idea of fame coming through, fame and honoring coming through hidden aspects like dealing with death, or sexuality, or dealing with the subconscious, or anything that Scorpio would naturally take a part of. There's a lot of interesting dynamics here. We also have Saturn being ruled by this Mars in Libra in the 9th. So Mars in his fall in Libra. So a sign that Mars does not necessarily like to be in the 9th house of travel, spirituality, foreigners, higher education. Those areas are going to be naturally very difficult. But also because it is tied to this Saturn, in Scorpio, I think that there's a really nice potential for that adversity turning into scholarship and recognition. So like traveling abroad would be both a terrible and a rewarding experience, because Mars in Libra doesn't necessarily make it conducive to the chart, but because that Mars is ruling the Saturn as chart ruler, I think it's important for us to understand that leaning on the weak parts of the chart when it comes to the 9th house aspects of travel, foreigners, higher education and spirituality, leaning on those weak aspects is actually what's going to help with the fame, the recognition down the road. Let's see. So we have Jupiter in Cancer retrograde. So Jupiter, again, the most prosperous planet of the chart, in the sign of his exaltation, absolutely fabulous, but it's retrograde. So although we would look at health issues with any retrograde planet in the 6th, there is some mitigation because Jupiter is placed really nicely. But the issue that I find is that, Jupiter from a medical perspective tends to make things swell. And when inappropriately placed, like being afflicted by Saturn via trine, touching Saturn via trine and the restriction, it's almost as if the more I look at this chart, the more it's going to be famous for medical issues, like famous for the body falling apart. Like there's a lot of medicine in the chart. There's a lot of really intense, very cool aspects. But the more I see these placements, it's as if the adversity becomes the success, and it all has to do with a lot of health stuff as well. Because this Jupiter in Cancer is going to swell the stomach. And it's also going to, from a retrograde perspective, touching Saturn, there's going to be stomach issues that almost catapult to fame. So it's as if like the medical traumas and the overcoming of those, if they are overcome, kind of lead to the recognition that comes down the road. Then we have the moon in Aries at an exact conjunction in the 3rd house of writing, teaching, communication. Like the more I look at this chart, the more it's very inspirational speaker territory. Very inspirational speaker territory. Because the moon is conjoining Uranus in Aries in the 3rd house of writing, teaching, communication. And it's being ruled by that Mars. The more I see this chart, the more I really look at it and say, this person is going to be used as an example to teach people hard lessons. Yeah, there's a lot of really intense but also very prominently placed aspects in this chart. And I think the combination of those two things is a difficult way to go through life, but at the same time can also be very rewarding. It's kind of like the farmer who does the very, very hard work but reaps a very, very large crop and has those peaks of abundance, but they're often through a lot of trial, a lot of difficulty, a lot of adversity, for sure. If there was one thing to lean into on this chart, it would be friendships. There's a lot of really good chemistry with friendships in the chart because we have this Mercury in Sagittarius in the 11th making a trine, or making a sextile rather, to the ascendant in Aquarius, which is then making a loose ascendant to the Moon Uranus conjunction. And I think friends and community organizations and resources that are more tribal, more of one's cloth, kind of leaning on the community in which you were raised, that's going to be a lot of very, very positive energy that you have at your disposal. But as you use them to recover, that's not going to offset the lessons that you need to learn. Like, once you get lifted back up by those people that are surrounding you, you have to face those hard lessons in the chart, which are going to be this Saturn in the 10th of wanting to be famous but not wanting to be famous, wanting success but not wanting success, the health issues in the 6th house with the stomach, and then also the idea of this afflicted Mars in the 9th, where, spirituality, travel, foreigners, higher education, those are going to be really, really difficult spots for you, but they will allow you to leverage this Moon in Aries in the 3rd of writing, teaching, communication, and every harmful aspect that comes your way, you're going to be able to transmute it into a form of success, into a form of success that, isn't your typical version of success, but it is success nonetheless. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much for submitting your charts. That is all that we have time for today. Started a little bit late, so we got to end a little bit early, unfortunately. But thank you for joining me for another round of the Astro-Babble. My name is Sam, and I do these on a regular basis. If you would like to submit your chart for the live stream, you can always just private message me your birth date, place, and exact birth time. I do need that exact birth time. We'll add you to the list. If you're interested in astrology, would like to learn astrology, or would like to schedule a private consult, you can always do so by checking out my website, which is scorpiorisingastrology.com, and looking at the consultations page or the online classes page. But until next time, I have to bid you adieu, and may the stars be ever in your favor.